Welcome to the Career Wanderlust podcast, your compass for new career horizons. Today, we are speaking with Arik Hesseldahl. Arik is a former journalist turned communications leader. For more than 20 years, he was a business and technology writer for media outlets including Recode, The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and Forbes. He interviewed hundreds of tech CEOs and founders, including Steve Jobs, Tim Cook, Meg Whitman, and Michael Dell. In 2016, he turned his newsroom skills to working with corporate clients. First, as the head of his own boutique communications firm, working with accounts that included Accenture, ServiceNow, and VMware. And then in 2018, one of those clients, the technology giant SAP, hired him to run its 32-person global content and multimedia team, which he did for 7 years. I'm really excited to learn more. Arik, thank you for joining us on the Career Wanderlust podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you. Please, could you share with us? I mean, you've done a lot in your career. And I love that you started as a journalist, you moved into communications. What do you feel has been some of your favorite career advice and why? What has helped carry you through all of these different aspects of your career?
There was never ever any one single piece of advice, but the thing that's really resonated with me for the most part is get the story right. Make the story
Right.
count.
Yeah, thank you for
I
that.
mean, it applies equally to journalism and corporate communications. If you're getting it wrong in any of those contexts, something's not right.
And it seems like that's a big thing these days. There is a lot that goes out that is incorrect, if you will. What are your comments on that? How do you think we should be dealing with that?
From a journalist's perspective, it's survival. So you have to get that stuff right. And I've screwed up many stories as a journalist, but in corporate communications, you have a lot of control over what's said and when, and you can at least, in my experience, and time isn't always optimal, but you can usually take the time and the effort to get it right. You can do that extra round of checking. You can do that extra gut checking with the people who know the right answers. And I've seen that fail a few times, and the results are predictable every single time.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, has that happened to you before?
I've written lots of corrections on stories. I got really good at writing the word sorry at the end of my for all things D and Recode when I would get something wrong. It was always embarrassing.
I was
Um,
gonna ask, if a communications professional got something wrong on accident, is there a suggestion you would have in the best way to deal with that?
don't hide, don't run, fix it
Mhm.
immediately in whatever way makes the most sense.
Mhm.
Whether
Yes.
it's a social media post, whether it's republishing a release. With the team that I ran at SAP, there were times when errors got through even the most rigorous fact checking process, and we would fix it. We would fix it as quickly as we could. And rarely was it something material, but it happens. It does happen. So you just have to have a procedure for doing it and own up to it. And don't, like I said, don't run, don't hide.
Yeah, I love it. I completely agree. It's just transparent. We're human. Made a mistake. Let's go fix it. So, now I'd love to hear a story. I'm sure you have a plethora of stories, I would imagine. Is there a story that something that happened to you in your career that ended up being an impactful lesson, something that you ended up learning from, and by sharing, other people might learn something from it as well?
The big one that I talk about most often, and I've never really talked about it publicly. I talk about it with my friends and people I work with all the time, but it was the how I made the shift from
Oh,
being a
yeah.
journalist. And
Oh, yeah.
there was this wonderful moment. I was talking with my therapist. You have all these personal insights when you're talking with your therapist.
Right?
And I was talking with my therapist. It must have been, I don't know, 2016, and I was newly married, and I was well into a career in journalism and trying to stick it out. And I was still convinced. I was a graduate of Columbia University Journalism School, and I felt that the bargain I had made with the world was that I was going to be a journalist. That was the peg that I was going to fit into for the rest of my working life. And I thought that for some reason it was required of me that I stick it out. And at some point, like I said, I was newly married. I had my daughter on the way, and I was really stuck and not very happy with the work I was doing anymore because it was getting too much of the same thing over and over again. And I suddenly had the realization that I didn't make a bargain with anybody. I didn't sign a contract with the world that said I had to be a journalist for the rest of my life. And suddenly that was a really powerful realization. And once I had it, I was suddenly free to start thinking about what I could do next. And it wasn't long before I had to figure that out in real time. And so the next big step in this story came in 2016, summer of 2016, is right about now, actually, end of July. And there was a new editor in chief at Recode, and he fundamentally didn't understand my beat and didn't think that it was all that worth pursuing or maintaining a full time reporter for. And he let me go. And frankly, I was fine with it. I should have been more freaked out than I was, but somehow I knew it was going to be okay.
Oh, that's great.
Negotiated my exit, and then I did.
Mhm.
And I tweeted, I did that thing where you write the statement out on your phone and you take a screenshot of the note and you put it out on Twitter as an image. And that was a period when I was still really active on what was then still called Twitter. And I put it out and I heard almost immediately, I got an email from a guy named Peter So, who was a managing director at Accenture. And he had been a reader and a regular reader. I've never met the man, but he introduced me to a person who had recently joined Accenture and was spinning up a new storytelling content operation within Accenture Digital. And so I went to lunch with that guy, and I had a contract job lined up within 3 to 6 weeks.
Fantastic.
And that was my first exposure to working directly in corporate comms. I'd done some little projects here and there. I had moderated some panels and I had done some ghostwriting for blogs and whatever, but it was not, this was full stack, busy content creation for one of the largest companies in the world.
Yes.
I had no idea what I was doing.
How
None whatsoever.
how did you feel when you were doing it? Were you
Um,
nervous? Did you feel ready? What was that? Because it's a big deal making a switch from one career, even though you're taking all of your skill sets and really it's a great switch to from journalist to communications, I believe.
yeah,
It still has its challenges and uncertainties, if you will.
yeah. I became a quick convert to the notion that my skills were transferable. And I found that they were. There was a lot of writing work that I was made for, writing under tight deadline pressure, improving things that were not very good. But then there was this one particular project that I always cite when I talk about this experience. It had to do with a keynote. There was a executive giving a keynote at a big conference in Dubai, one of the world's biggest tech conferences, one of the world's most sophisticated, high spending technology audiences was going to be at this keynote. And the fundamental truth, and I'm not going to name this person, he's a great executive. He's long since left Accenture, but um, great executive. He wasn't a really strong, at least for these purposes, he wasn't a really strong speaker, at
Mm,
least not from
that
what we could
happens.
tell.
Yeah.
And the material that had been prepared for him, which I had no hand in to this point, was really not all that special. And so I asked a couple of questions. I was said, "What can we do?" I was asked, "What could we do to improve this?" And I started asking questions like a reporter. There's this other executive who's a really strong speaker. Is he in Dubai? Could we maybe call him in to help out on stage? No, he's going to be in New York. What did we see? What did you do with the address last year? Let me go look at some of the speeches. And there was this one speech, this is the 2015 GTEx that Accenture had given that involved a hologram technology. And it was really exciting looking, but it was demonstrated in the most boring way possible. It had three people sitting on couches backstage, and their likeness was projected onto the stage in front of the audience. And that was interesting to look at, but they weren't saying anything special. It was boring, not memorable at all. I said, okay, what's the deal with this technology, this hologram technology? Well, it turns out Accenture had invented it. I don't remember how it worked, but basically it gave the impression of a person standing on stage as if they were there and they could be somewhere else. I said, does it work remotely? The answer was yes. Where is the speaker, the really strong speaker, he's still with Accenture, and I will name him because if anybody knows him, they knows that his speaking is his superpower. His name is Paul Doherty. He's the CTO of Accenture. superpower, super dynamic speaker, really excellent. He always does a great job. He's going to be in New York. Could he conceivably appear on stage as a hologram from New York in Dubai? And I worked up a proposal for that, and it went up the chain of command, and the answer came down yes.
Hmm.
And
Love
it
it.
was and it was fantastic. And no, anybody who was there doesn't remember what they said. And I worked on the dual talk tracks, and there were multiple, probably dozens of people working on the slideware, the PowerPoint decks to accompany each of them. But everybody who was in the room, and I was not, but everybody who was in the room remembers that Paul Doherty blinked onto stage in Dubai from New York and did a joint address with the other fellow.
Absolutely.
And so that was my first big success at Accenture, and helped me make my way in there. Ultimately, the person I worked with looked me straight in the eye even after that, and he said, "I'm not going to onboard you here. You're going to have to figure yourself out here." And I could not. That pivot proved too hard for me, and frankly, I had billed enough, and my daughter was due in November that year, so I had basically made enough to self fund my paternity
Mm.
leave.
Oh,
So
that's a gift.
I took a break, but that was how I broke into corporate
Amazing.
communications.
I love that. It's a great example all around too. It just simply to ask the simple question, how can we make this better? Such a simple question, but so powerful.
Yeah, and what I think about that is that people don't ask the right questions enough, and that's the advice I try to give people. And that's another thing, another example where my reporter's skill set comes into play. I can ask the right questions because I've been paid I made my living asking questions for more
Mhm.
than 20 years. And so I'm not afraid of asking the impertinent question, the question that's likely to tick somebody off, or the seemingly dumb question that a lot of other people might not be willing to ask. I'm willing to do that.
Oh, those
And
are all
you
incredibly
have
important. Yeah, you have to. I'm curious because the question, I think you're absolutely right. Learning to ask the right questions is an invaluable skill set to have. And the right questions are going to depend on the situation and who you're speaking with. I completely understand that. But I'm wondering if you've found certain questions to be incredibly valuable to you throughout in different situations, or certain questions that you go to often that you could share with us that we could maybe add to our own toolkit, if you will.
that's an interest. I have never really thought about it that way. About is there one go-to question? In the early days when I was a up and coming tech writer at Forbes, or even before that, Electronic News. That was an old trade journal I worked at. I was interested in how things worked. And so I would ask, how does that work? What does that mean? And in the 90s, everything was telecom. Everybody was building telecom infrastructure in those days. And so I had a telecom terminology encyclopedia at my desk, so I could always look things up, and that turned out to be important. But it soon got away from that because I got tired of having to describe how electrons fly across a chip, or what a router does, or why is computer memory expensive or cheap. Those were actual stories that I did, but sometimes they would help tell a story, but really it came down to, why are you doing this? Why are you creating this business? What problem are you trying to solve? And that really became the fundamental, story I was always trying to tell. And that's where I started to have the most fun, is the people creating something new. And I learned when I went to Forbes magazine, that was early in my career. Over 5 or 6 years I was there, I picked up the formula. There's a formula to writing a Forbes story for the magazine. And at the time I was detailed to the website. That's how I joined Forbes, was writing for Forbes.com. But over time I started being asked to write magazine features too. And there was a formula. And the formula was always very simple. There was a smart person challenging the established convention, this or that, challenging the assumptions of this or that industry, and finding a better way. And suddenly money is raining down on them. That's how it works. That's the capitalist. That's the capitalist tool theory of storytelling. And I did some of the same work at Business Week, with a little bit more of a news focus. Business, the old
Mhm.
McGraw Hill owned Business Week. It's now Bloomberg Business Week. I learned to tell that kind of formula story, and it serves me well. I'm still using that formula in my client work today when I do case studies and that sort of thing for them.
Mhm.
There's always a hero, there's always a beginning state, a problem, a solution, and an end state.
Mhm.
Nothing changes
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah. We love that formula, don't we, as as people?
Yeah,
We do
yeah,
love
it's
that formula.
really
I'm
hard,
I love the formula. Yeah.
and it's really hard for people who haven't learned it. It's
Mhm.
really hard, I found. In a lot of corporate communication settings, people think they know the story, and they really don't. You
Mhm.
have to know what your story is about.
Yeah. And going back to that question you shared, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? That is a magic question in so many different avenues of career and personal life, really. Getting to that root and you can figure things out from there. So that's fantastic. I'm curious, have you had any really big challenge? Everyone's had big challenges. What's been a really big challenge that you faced in your career that you're willing to share with us? And how did you overcome it?
So as you said in the setup, one of my clients hired me to run SAP hired me in 2018 to come in and run its global content team. And the fact that it had a global content team, it was literally called SAP News. So I was in charge of internal storytelling. So we had a dedicated internal news site for 100,000
Very
employees around the
cool.
world.
Hmm.
I also was in charge of the external news site, so everything where all the press releases were published, all the feature stories, corporate blogs, all of that
Big
stuff
job.
was under my portfolio in English and multiple languages, by the way. Then I also had video and social media. So I had the YouTube channel and Twitter and LinkedIn presences as well. So I was in charge of a big portfolio for one of the biggest technology companies in the world. And it was great. And the fact that they had a staff, a well-resourced team of creative storytellers, some of who had been journalists in the past, like me, spoke very well. But I get to this company the first day and I have absolutely no idea what's going on. People are using phrases and words and terminology that I don't understand. And I'm like, again, it was a little bit like Accenture. Accenture was, multiple fire hoses and it proved to be too much for me. SAP was one great big fire hose with its own internal language. And I had to learn it quickly. But the most important piece of advice I got from my boss, Nicola Leska, at the time was take your time. Thankfully, she gave me permission to bring myself up to speed over time and figure out where I fit in the organization and how I was going to manage these 32 people. And that was another thing. And I found over time that I was a pretty good manager. I was a good empathetic boss. I say that without any humility, but I was
Incredibly
willing to
important.
listen and I was willing to work with them. And so that was the big challenge was learning to how to fit within a large organization and trusting my gut and trusting
Yeah.
my instincts a lot more.
And that's taking your time is great advice. Just to slow down and take it in, really absorb what's happening, think about the best ways to go about things. Often we feel like we have to do things quickly. And I think we're feeling that way. We don't take everything in that we could be taking in. And often we'll maybe make a little bit of a mistake in the decisions we make moving forward. So I think that's great advice and advice that we can all use a little more of these
Yeah.
days.
And it was antithetical to the journalist in me. I was used to hourly news cycles, switching on and off, and having to get a story turned around in hours or minutes sometimes. And thankfully, large corporations have a tendency to move a lot slower. Decisions take a lot longer to happen. Sometimes things get rushed, and there's plenty of opportunity for that. But I did have that opportunity to learn. And there was also an annual cycle of things. There's things that happen in this quarter and things that happen in the fourth quarter. And then thankfully, the summer is really slow. So I had the opportunity to learn. And if you take those opportunities to get yourself out of fire hose mode and learn what's going on, especially in that first year to 18 months when with a new employer, it's worth all the valuable time in the world.
Oh, yeah. You can add so much more value as you move
Yes,
forward when you do that.
exactly. And that's precisely what I learned.
Yeah.
And that lines up exactly with how I would say it.
Yeah.
I added more value as I learned more.
Yeah. So that's great. Now, one of the questions I always like to ask, just because we are, and I'm curious what you have to say about this, because we are being fed constantly, even without our permission. We're always being fed information. So I love to know what people read or watch or listen to proactively feed their mind, to positively impact their life in some way. So, what's something that you have read, watched, or listened to that positively impacted you that you think could help others as well?
First advice I try to tell people is to turn off cable news. I have
Yes.
I have stopped it. I will occasionally look in on Rachel Maddow, but no, cable news is not the constructive force for good that it once was, and I don't care what your persuasion is, it's not good for you.
I agree.
Turn it off. So that's advice number 1. I'm still pretty old school in my consumption habits. Everything is, for the most part, digital. New York Times and Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, those are my big 3. I'm also a big fan of The Economist. I've been reading that for a really long time. I think it's very smart. I don't always agree with it, but it's smart. Challenges me. I started reading it in my late 20s and I never stopped. So those are my big 4.
Nice.
I
Feel
love the New York Review of Books. I read
ooh,
that a lot. That gets me
ooh.
makes me feel very smart.
I admit I haven't not been looking at the New York Review of Books. That is something I need to have on my repertoire for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, it's a good one. I picked it up one day. I had this habit of stopping by this really terrific newsstand when I lived in New York City, and I would pick up a lot of interesting things, and I picked up that, on a lark, and I just really fell in love with it, so I've been reading it ever since.
Thank you. I'm going to check that out. That's very helpful. So, last question before you go. I just like to throw this out just to see what you have to say. But I believe we all have personal superpowers that, I mean, a lot of times we're born with certain things that we're just have natural gifts, and a lot of times we also develop these superpowers over time. I'm curious if you have a personal superpower that has perhaps one that you developed over time that has really benefited you in life.
I can talk to almost anybody, given the right set of circumstances. I'm naturally shy by inclination. It's just true. I'm not as extroverted as I sometimes make myself out to be. But when I have that opportunity to talk to pretty much anybody, it's a I can talk to anybody about almost any subject. Even if I know nothing about that subject, I can draw interesting nuggets out of them and then I can come back with interesting questions and have a conversation with them. And it's a skill that you hone doing literally thousands of interviews, which I've done, but also sitting at bar stools in New York City. You could so I was always practicing it. And I never really noticed that it was a superpower until it started coming to me that, yeah, I could do that. And people would ask me and actually pay me decent money to do interviews, either virtually or in person or whatever, because they didn't have anybody who could do it comfortably with an executive or a founder or somebody of that nature. So that's my superpower. I don't know what you call that. Interviewing? You call that conversation? I don't know.
Connection, yeah, just being able to talk to people and anyone, anywhere, it is an absolute superpower, and getting them being able to get them to actually speak with you, share something with you. I can tell that you're someone that probably makes people feel very comfortable to share their story or open up and what have you. Is there I asked you about go-to questions work-wise. Is there a go-to question you have when you meet someone you've never met before? Like the person on the bar stool, if you will?
Yeah. I used to go to this one bar in on the Upper West Side of New York. It's not there anymore, but turned out there was a committee of regulars that I lived close by, so I went to this bar a lot, and I got to know all the committee of regulars. And there was this one magazine editor who I got to know really well, and there was another guy who was a musician, and there was another guy who was a photographer, and I could talk to them about anything that there was going on, and we talked about what was going on in the news, and we would talk about what's going on at the office and who's getting who's having trouble at home or whatever, all these interesting personal questions. And it just became, tell me what's going on. What's
Yeah.
happening? Tell me about
Mhm.
you. Tell me about what's important to you and why. That's basically, I'm
Mm,
just
I love that. Yeah.
winding my way to that point, but it was different versions of that.
Yeah. Yeah. People love to talk about that, what's important to them and why. It lights them up, right? It's a great way to make connection. Eric, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on the Career Wanderlust podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us on the Career Wanderlust podcast. If you find value in learning from others, give us a like and subscribe. If you're looking to grow your communications, marketing, public relations, or sales and biz dev team with the best talent and quickly, check us out at paradigmstaffing.com and submit a request. We are wishing you a most successful and fulfilling career. Until next time.